Hello, my name is Pascal Peduzzi. I'm the director of Grid Geneva, which is a center for analytics for the United Nations Environment Programme. Today we're going to talk about sand. When we think about sand, we are usually thinking about beautiful beaches. That's what we think we're doing with sand most of the time. But in fact, our relationship with sand is more like this. We're mixing that with water, cement, and gravels, and we are making concrete. And with concrete, we are building roads, buildings, dams. We even use that for glasses, be it for windows or for glasses. We are using that for computer chips. In fact, our entire development and entire societies are built on sand. But sand is produced very slowly at the geological scale. For example, all the rivers and glaciers of the world, every year they're shifting about 24 billion tons of this material. But we humans are using it twice as much. How do we know how much we're using of this material? It's very difficult because in fact there is no global monitoring. But what we know is the amount of cement that we're using. We're using 4.1 billion tons of cement per year, and this has been recorded. And the vast majority of that is being used in China. The relationship with cement and sand is quite one-to-one. It's not that this is not the recipe for making concrete, but we use sand for many other things than just making concrete. So if you look at this graph from the use of sand versus cement in the United States, we see that there is nearly one correlation of sand of use with cement. And in fact, it's about 10 to 1. So for every single tons of cement, we're using 10 tons of sand. Meaning that if we extrapolate that on top of land reclamation that we're using, for example, it's not only for building purpose, but we also use that for making artificial islands. For example, in Dubai, this is an image in 2001, and this is the same place in 2011. One of these artificial island structure used 1.2 billion tons of sand. Singapore is also using a vast amount of sand for increasing its territory. Since 1973, they increased the territory by 23.2% using sand from Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, Cambodia, and then as far as Myanmar and Vietnam. So if you get this amount of sand, we come to something like 50 billion tons of sand per year. Now, this amount is really big. So it is enough for building a wall of 27 meters high by 27 meters wide all around planet Earth every single year. So where is it coming from? We can take it from quarries on the land. So this has an impact because we need to clear the vegetation, then we dig a hole. It has an obvious impact on the landscape. But actually in this location, when it's done on quarries, sand is not a dynamic part of the ecosystem. It's like a deposit. So it doesn't harm that much the environment as as bad as it look. We can actually fill the gap afterward with inert waste and then put some earth on top of that and replant vegetation or use that as agricultural land. However, this is something that will be a development over 50, 60 years. Now, there are other places where we're taking sand is a big, more problematic. For example, this is me in Tunisia. People have been taking sand that up to my shoulder height, lowering the ground that much. And that is placing those people more vulnerable to storm surge and sea level rise, making these land more susceptible to be infiltrated by salty water that can affect the aquifer. People are also taking sand from rivers, and when you do that, you are actually making the shape of the river, deeper, and you may have impact on the erosion of the river banks, and it can lead to further flood downstream or drought upstream. And there's several other impacts on fauna and flora because you're changing the turbidity and changing the ecosystem. You can take it from the beaches. Again, this is where sand is playing a dynamic part of it, like in rivers. Sand on the beaches are actually protecting our shoreline against storm surge, against sea level rise, and against infiltration of salty water. It also preempts any touristic development in the future if you remove all this sand from the beach. And obviously, it's destroying the habitat of this beach where turtles are nesting and birds are feeding themselves. Imagine this beach after just one day of operation, it's gone. And then they go to the next beach and extending the process and impact further. Sand is also taken from the marine environment. These giant boats, it looks like a huge vacuum cleaner, and that's what actually they do. They are vacuum cleaning the bottom of the sea by taking all the sand, crunching all the microorganisms that are living there, and those microorganisms are the ones that are feeding the fishes that are then feeding bigger fishes and so on. And when this boat is taking the sand, they are rejecting particles that are too fine, creating this plume that we see, changing the turbidity of the water. This operation at the bottom and the release of this plume has impact on biodiversity and on fishery. But also, when you're removing sand offshore, you're creating a gap, and that gap will be filled by sand that can behave a bit like a liquid by gently flowing in the direction of this gap to slowly fill this gap, creating beach erosion. And this is happening in many different places, not only because of the fact that we're taking sand away, but also because of sea level rise and intensification of waves and other destruction of the coastal ecosystem. But by taking sand away, we are accelerating this process. So why don't we use the sand from the deserts? Well, the wind erosion produces sand that is very round and very fine, and it does not apply as the same as the sand that you can get from glacier or wave erosion. It doesn't stick very well, it's not edgy enough, so not very fit for construction, and even less so for land reclamation. Also, it takes deserts are by definition not places that are inhabited, so if you need to transport this sand from the desert to where you need it, it will be extremely costly. So the trends of use of sand is accelerated by the fact that we are living in the urban and urbanization. So people are now moving from villages into the cities, requesting new infrastructures for housing, for infrastructures for school, for healthcare, for airport, from dikes and bridges and so on. So those infrastructures are heavily depending on the building material, obviously. And also we have a population dynamic. The world population will stabilize between 9.5 or 11 billion in 2050, but by then African population will double, and by doubling we mean another 1.27 billion people on top of the existing African population. So this associated with migration from rural to urban area, and as well as catching back on the infrastructures that they need for their development, mean that there is a huge pressure on sand and building material. So, is it time for panicking? No, it's time to look at solutions. And that's what we did. We asked experts about what we can do. And in terms of reducing our footprint on sand resources and how we can reduce the impact on the environment. So basically, we have to rethink our consumption model. That's not only for sand, it's valid for all the type of resources that we're using. But basically, we can reduce our demand for sand by making sure that the projects are well thought, and it's really something that we need. We can also reuse the building or retrofit them instead of knocking them down. Now, if we need to destroy them and rebuild, then we can recycle the concrete, and part of that material can be then reused for rebuilding. And we can also retrieve material in our dam site. And in fact, in our waste, we can use the bottom ash from the waste to make a substitute for sand. We can also improve the way we're extracting sand by making environmental impact assessment prior to extract the sand and making sure that we have the environment, making it as clean as it is or even better after the operation, so preserving the biodiversity and making it in a nice way. So what are the next steps? Well, we circulated this report through all the member states, and they recognized the finding of our report, and they adopted the resolutions for sustainable sand management. And now this is what we're going to do is to collect information on sustainable practices, identify the knowledge gap, present existing solutions and best practices. And this is the way that we will inform member states about how to better improve their relationship with sand and making it more sustainable.